Welcome everyone. I once again am having computer problems this morning, so right now I don't have a camera, so I apologize for that. They're working on it. So I think we'll just go ahead and start because I don't want to keep people waiting. Let me just check in here with everybody. Can you hear me, guys?
We can hear you, Rebecca.
All right, excellent. At least you can hear me. That's positive. Okay. So, thank you all for joining us today, and for the people who are coming back, really appreciate that you joined us last week and you're coming back again. My name's Rebecca Tepper, and I am the Chief of Massachusetts Attorney General Healy's Energy and Environment Bureau. And as I think many people know, this is the second of our two think tanks that we're hosting on the regulation of gas utilities during this time of great change. Last week, as many of you know, we focused on planning and infrastructure, and today we're going to focus on rates. We really appreciate the many notes and comments that participants provided during the meeting last week and afterwards, and we were really pleased to see that so many of you found the discussion helpful. And we also got some helpful suggestions, which we tried to incorporate today. So last week we talked a lot about how we plan for a decarbonized future in a way that's fair, safe, reliable, and affordable. And our panelists outlined a lot of challenges, such as decreasing gas demand, increased customer migration, and aging infrastructure. Today we're talking about rates, and there's, as you know, a lot going on in the topic of rates, and we only have 2 hours. So we're going to focus our discussion on 3 broad areas. First, the role that gas rate mechanisms can play to support an equitable transition to the decarbonized future. Second, how we align gas utility financial incentives and business models with a decarbonized future. And third, how rate making can continue to support a safe, reliable, and affordable delivery during the transition for the customers who are still there. So as I noted last week, this is a first step. We know there will be many more discussions and many more issues to address and a lot more views to be considered. And we're not going to answer all the questions here today. We know that, but we do feel confident that our panelists will help us better understand the options. So before we start, I did want to thank the AGO team who are working so hard to get my picture up right now, and Joanne Bodemer, Jessica Friedman, and Cecilia Milano, who really are the workers behind all of this, and they've been working for months and really have pulled it off in a great way. So really want to thank you all. I also wanted to give special thanks to Jolette Westbrook and Natalie Karras of EDF. Natalie and Jolette really have been instrumental in the forming and shaping of these events right from the beginning. So thank you all. So I'll give you a quick housekeeping matters and we'll move it along. So the agenda for the next 2 hours is like it was last week, we'll have a moderated led panel discussion until 11:25, take a 5-minute break, and then the panelists will try to get in some audience questions. If you have questions during the panel talk, you're going to put them in the question box. And then our team, AGO team, will collect them and ask the questions to the panelists in that last half hour. We are recording today's event, and we hope to have that recording available for viewing later. So we have quite a team gathered here today. Their bios are in the chat, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. If I went over their bios, I'd probably take about a half hour of our time because they're all so distinguished. But first we have Dr. Sue Tierney, who is a Senior Advisor at Analysis Group. Then we have Natalie Karras, Senior Director and Lead Counsel of Energy Markets and Utility Regulations at the Environmental Defense Fund. Next is Mark LaBelle, who is an Associate at the Regulatory Assistance Project. And finally, we have Sherry Billamori. I asked her how to pronounce her name yesterday, and I even practiced it, and I still blew it. It's Billamori. And she manages Rocky Mountain Institute's Carbon-Free Building Program. So I'm just gonna make sure I can see you all. That's not it. right, sorry, just give me a sec here. All right, for some reason I'm not seeing you either. Wow, this is
We
so.
lost Natalie. Natalie, you need to click on your webcam. There you go.
So interestingly enough, I can't see anybody either. So this is super annoying. Erin, is there anything that I can do about that?
We're here, but there's nothing interesting going on in our cameras, so I promise you.
Yeah,
No,
and we're all very sympathetic. Of
all right.
frustrating
Okay,
that
let's just move it along then. Let's just, we will not, we'll talk, I'll talk as if I'm on the phone with you. So I'll just start with, just throw out a sort of a big question, which is, you know, as gas throughput and customers decrease, and that we have talked about this problem, the smaller number of customers, will be bearing a financial obligation of maintaining what is already an aging system. And the small number of customers will likely include many low-income customers. So wondering if we could talk a little bit about some of the regulatory tools we can use to mitigate or reduce that financial impact of this transition. And you're going to have to sort of call on each other because I can't see you.
Who wants to go first?
Go for it, Mark.
All right, I'm happy to start with a list. So as you'll see in my bio, we recently put out a report on a range of gas utility reform issues. So I'll just touch on a few different things. So first links back to last week's conversation, improved planning and decision criteria for new investments and contracts is a really big deal and will influence long-term costs. And that's the sort of the input into all of this rate making stuff. And there's lots of links with things that we might call programs, energy efficiency programs, electrification programs, and potentially new programs like non-pipes solutions as alternatives to capacity and investments. And then we could increase customer contributions to line extensions. So any new line extensions, new customers have to pay a little bit more upfront. We can accelerate depreciation timelines, so we're paying a little bit more now in exchange for lower long-term rates. There's alternative funding sources and securitization. And then there's cost allocation and rate design, where there's lots of different smaller and medium-sized tools to split up costs among the remaining customers. So that's my list.
That's a good list.
Just that should take.
Just a little. Sue, you want to talk a little bit about this?
I'd be happy to, and I'm really glad that Mark started because I am aware of this great report that you guys just put out. It's very helpful. I would just add a slight shading onto some of the things that Mark said, because I agree with his list entirely. I would add communications. Right now, we have just an incredibly challenging set of circumstances ahead, and both the regulators and other energy officials and companies need to be providing a lot more information about the coming transition and what some of the implications are for that. With regard to depreciation schedules, I think it would be particularly important to be doing that in the context of investments in replacement of aging and problematic infrastructure. There could be situations where those changed depreciation schedules would really make it attractive to actually begin to shut down certain circuits on the gas system, where keeping those upgraded with maintenance costs will just make it much more likely that there'll be stranded cost, and there could be places where it's really cost effective to switch customers over to electricity. The other thing
Can I just ask a quick question about that?
Yeah.
So just getting a little bit into the weeds, with depreciation, at what point would one start to decide to depreciate? Is it when you have sort of an overall plan of how you're going to get rid of or retire the aging assets? Do you do it in advance? Do you just do it for the particular thing you're doing right now? I'm worried about that. I don't understand the timing of it.
I can
Great.
jump in
Sure,
here with some
go ahead.
thoughts if that's
That'd be
okay.
great. Yes.
I think there are a couple different considerations here, and I think especially given that we are asking all of our agencies and all of the decisions to change in pretty significant ways, there can sometimes be a little bit of a tossing the ball back and forth of who is responsible for coming up with the plan, and we can't necessarily execute until we have the plan. And I think that that type of planning is really important, but I also think there are things that we can do today. And one of the questions around accelerated depreciation, I think, can be if you run the math with accelerated depreciation, knowing that based on our climate goals, we need to be using gas in very limited or not at all or fundamentally changed ways by 2050. And it becomes extremely expensive to do that in an accelerated depreciation way, then I think that's also a time where you can begin to think about non-pipe solutions and see whether there are other more cost-effective options taking that into account. But I agree with you, there's this sequencing of order of operations question, and I think in my ideal world, we would be able to agree, whether that's legislatively or otherwise, that by X date, the gas system, the distributed gas system needs to look fundamentally different or needs to have shrunk by this amount and then work from there. But I think there are ways to make different decisions now, even without that type of firm plan in place. Mark mentioned gas line extensions, which are one of my favorite wonky things to be talking about. And I think there are lots of ways that we can be making changes around the edges, even as we also know we need to be changing the big thing in the middle, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, what are some of those misaligned incentives that we need to think about?
So my favorite low-hanging fruit on that front is the revenue decoupling techniques. That revenue per customer decoupling that we use in Massachusetts, as well as Rhode Island, and they actually just started getting rid of this in New York. That revenue per customer decoupling incentivizes gas companies to keep adding customers between rate cases and to resist customers that switch from gas to other fuels. So that's a fairly straightforward regulatory mechanism that pushes towards more gas customers, more investment in the system. And I think that's pretty low hanging fruit to unwind that particular piece, which they just started to do in New York.
Yeah, and I would go back to this depreciation schedule issue. So depreciation is, as we know, the number of years over which you will spread the cost recovery for some new investment. So there's a lot of investment already in the ground. And one of the challenging things about depreciation schedules for the existing infrastructure of pipelines and so forth is that we don't really know the extent to which you could the lifetime of methane being used in the pipeline system. But B, we don't really know the extent to which there can be renewable gas using that existing pipe or, the pipe system. And then third, the extent to which there is some other molecule, the energy carrying molecule that can be delivered over those pipes. And some people talk about hydrogen as a possibility for some kind of blend. But the reason I'm mentioning those is that uncertainty does affect a depreciation schedule. And people have to think about depreciation schedules really differently than in the past. In the past, it was just, how long is that pipe going to last? And then spread it across with lots of, experts disagreeing on one thing or another. But now there's a different element to the discussion, which is from a public policy point of view, how long can we have this system, and therefore how long do we have to recover it from consumers? Now, I mentioned that with either new extensions or for upgrades or maintenance of aging infrastructure, that should really have a very short life in terms of depreciation. Unless you are a true believer in 100% renewable gas and or 100% hydrogen over those pipes, you're going to have a short-lived life for those new investments.
So Sherry, Sue has gotten us right into the muck of what are these pipes going to be used for in the future, and if we don't necessarily know that they're going to be retired, what do we do?
And that's the question. What do we do?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I just think, it's there are a lot of uncertainties, right? And if we're trying to figure out what to do today, are there certain sort of no regret things that we could do that we should, in sort of in the rate making context, that we should be getting to now?
Sure. I think that there's also a big difference between expansion of the gas system and the repair and maintenance questions. And I think the second of those questions are much more complicated. But given that we know that it is cost effective today to build all electric new construction, and given that to be true, that then we don't need to be expanding the system further, because those new buildings can be all electric, and then you don't have to deal with the question of what would be in the pipes of those new of any new builds and the lifetime of those. I think the question of what do we do with what's already in the ground, and how and to what proportion and for what end uses renewable natural gas or hydrogen or any of those other alternative fuels might be used, is one complicated set of questions. But from my perspective, there's no reason to be building out new gas pipe infrastructure with the intention of using it for any of those alternative fuels. From what I've also read from Massachusetts Roadmap and other sources, it seems like Massachusetts is on a path to be really thinking of building decarbonization in the context of electrification rather than a RNG first perspective, which I agree with. I think it is the logical solution in most cases, and we know that it's cost effective and carbon reducing in many. It's carbon reducing mostly across the board, and is cost effective in many scenarios as well. So I think the questions around RNG and hydrogen become much more important when we are talking about industrial uses or uses that are much harder to electrify than buildings might be. And so those are sort of a couple different questions that might have different answers as well.
Could I just add on to that, Rebecca, by saying that I totally agree with what Sherry said about electrification in new buildings. I mean, it ought to be the default condition, and so forth. Massachusetts, which is a heavily already built environment, is likely to be needing to face questions about renovations and whether those should be electrification only options. I think that's going to be the challenge, and communications clearly providing information to every homeowner who's going to be anticipating a renovation, so that you are, again, the appliance options and various other things need to address renovation electrification, and then you go back to the same questions about that existing infrastructure as well. We keep coming back to planning things, so I'm sorry.
Yeah. Are there places where you think we could use utility rate making to incent customers to support the decarbonized future?
Mark,
Rebecca can't see you. So.
No, it's fine. Any of us could take it. Whoever wants to go. But I have a couple thoughts. I mean, I think that smarter rate design and cost allocation is part of that. Can help support the transition to the extent that we have, these times where gas scarcity really drives costs both on the gas side and the electric side. That should be reflected in prices. And there's a lot of sensitivities there, particularly for low-income customers. But to the extent that we have these issues, people should be paying for the costs that they're causing, and that the high winter gas costs should be a consideration for people choosing between fuels. So if we can reflect that in prices, that should help improve some decision making. So that's one answer to your question, I think.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
This is Natalie. I just wanted to jump in here because I wanted to provide an observation, which is it feels to me like we have layered on a set of rigorous climate objectives on top of an existing regulatory framework that's been in place for decades without, taking a step back and seeing what we need to change and root out to make this work. And I'm thinking about how, year after year, utilities continue to forecast increases and send out in their system. They, continue to develop gas customer expansion pilot programs. And if we jump ahead and we're only focused on how do we electrify, we have to, first root out these programs that have to change. And I feel like a lot of the conversations are framed around what should the utility do? I think we also have to say, what does the regulator need to do? At the end of the day, the DPU has to ensure just and reasonable rates, and the existing tools, in my opinion, aren't going to get us there. We're going to have to sharpen those. And I see this connection between the session last week on planning and the discussion today, rate recovery. We have to connect the two. There has to be a long-term plan, and we have to hold utilities accountable to that plan by connecting cost recovery to that. And so I think you asked the question, what's a no regret measure? That to me is step one.
Yeah.
Connecting, today it's the forecast gas and supply plan, and make sure that we update that tool to build in a greenhouse gas assessment of the different choices, and build in, okay, what's going to happen when you come in for cost recovery and these things don't align. So that to me is kind of step one.
That's really helpful. And I think, sort of the questions of what things are we doing now that we're doing right now are, counterproductive. What should we stop doing and change? Right. And I think the example of the way we do the forecast and supply plans is a really good one. And I think
Rebecca, one thing I would.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Maggie.
This is Sherry.
Sorry.
One thing that I would add to Natalie's point about increasing gas customers is that many places still have oil to gas conversion programs that really offer customers a big incentive for moving from fuel oil or propane to natural gas. And we know that it is both cost effective and carbon reducing for an oil customer to electrify where possible. And so there's no, often people use this metaphor of digging the hole deeper. And I think it is a blunt metaphor, but also a useful one, especially when you think about the lifetime of a furnace or a water heater, and that you are effectively locking in the emissions for the lifetime of that device. So I think there are also very specific programs and things of that nature, like oil to gas conversion programs, that are part of that weeding out and change, both in the fundamental business model and then also in all of these other ways that it's showing up. I want to say it in New York, it was a NYSEG rate case negotiation in which one of the agreements in the settlement negotiation was that the company would stop advertising gas to new customers and stop the intention of expanding their gas business. And I haven't seen that in other places across the country yet, but I think it's those types of, getting a mailer that says gas is the clean solution and you should choose it. Those are the types of things that also need to be changing.
Yeah, I think we're gathering a pretty good list of stuff that's digging us further in the hole that needs to be stopped. I mean, you've got line extensions, you have new customers. I mean, there's quite a few things that it sounds like we could start doing right away that at least would not make us in a worse situation than we are now.
Rebecca, this is Sue, could I just add one thought to that are things we should be doing in parallel to everything that Natalie, Sherry, and Mark have said. And that is to think about this more holistically, so that on the electric side, we make sure that we are also having a rate design and a cost recovery mechanism that does not disadvantage electrification strategies. I will probably get myself in trouble, but I'll dip my toe into making sure that as part of the rate design for net metering and or net billing, having people who are not participating in those programs having to pick up larger and larger costs will be a disincentive for electrification. And so having and that's really a problem here. And I'm not saying that net metering is the problem, but those rate design elements that on the electric side are going to make it harder to shift and less attractive for people is a real fundamental challenge here. So doing everything to price things properly on the electric side is also really key.
Yeah, that raises a really good point of, if you're a regulator right now and you traditionally have looked at electric and gas separately, everything is completely separate, right? How do you actually start changing that? Like what, it's sort of in a practical matter, what could be combined so that they need to have some kind of overarching plan that involves electric and gas? Or maybe there even needs to be, some statutory changes that specifically allow for that.
Rebecca, this is Natalie. I can weigh in on that. So, I think when we talk about planning, that can mean a lot of different things, but I do think one important planning exercise is around a coordinated joint electric, study, feasibility assessment of that, combined service territory to understand the challenges and opportunities. And I noticed in the DPU's order in 2080, when they opened it, there's a footnote 3 that mentions electric utilities, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. So they're starting to think about that connection and the need to bring in the electric utilities to this conversation, because so far, and I think we're at the beginning of this journey, we're just kind of talking about gas utilities, and I think it has to be more of a coordinated joint effort so we can address some of the issues that Sue has identified and others going forward.
Go ahead, Sue.
Thanks, Mark. I think there are really different roles for different players here. There is clearly a role from an integrated energy systems point of view that could either be held by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, where they are looking at these cross-sectoral issues in a more integrated way. But even the DPU, which would traditionally be in a position to react in rate-making settings to these siloed gas and siloed electric issues, even they have an obligation, I think, looking forward to assure that gas rates remain just and reasonable. And there may be things that need to happen across the two utilities, or even in terms of anticipating some planning approach with rate making implications for gas companies that looks ahead at the death spiral problem and having completely unsustainable rates for all remaining gas consumers, not to mention low income ones. So thinking in a planning and really more regulatory role as opposed to just adjudicatory decisions in rate cases, I think that the DPU has an important role to play here in a leadership mode. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, I think that's right. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously one of the hard issues. Who should be doing the planning and coordination? Because although there's benefits of coordination across companies, particularly where there's sort of shared service territories, although the service territories in Massachusetts are much less overlapping than almost any other state in the country, a lot of the Northeast is fragmented like that, I suppose. But the other thing I worry about is that there's tensions and conflicts across your financial incentives with these big multinational, multi-fuel companies, right? And that you know, some of the places that are pursuing electrification the most have electric only utilities because they don't have a conflict. They're happy to go and try to convert people to their fuel. So, you know, there's pros and cons to increased linkages here. And then there's other fuels. There's district heating and cooling, you know, to the extent that we want to put other things on the table. You know, obviously the geo micro district concept here in Massachusetts is being piloted. So, you know, how do you have competition across all these fuels to put customers on low and zero carbon heating? I think is a big picture question that we should worry about as well. You know, and for that reason, I think some of the planning functions and coordination should really be put with EEA or state agencies rather than relying on the utilities to do it themselves.
Yeah. Did anybody else want to talk about that?
I guess I would have one observation, which is I see a role for like the state agencies to do some of the planning, but you know, to actually make this happen, we have to have information from the gas companies. There's going to be, you know, hydraulic modeling studies and detailed information about their systems that they will have to provide. And one thing that I think another kind of no-brainer here is to address this information asymmetry problem, where we start to make some of this information more transparent and help, you know, interested stakeholders understand what's happening with the system, where are the areas that are low-hanging fruit that, you know, could do the transition first. I think that's a really important piece to this.
Yeah, if you're running a gas utility today, you know, you're in the business of planning, building, maintaining, and operating pipes to deliver gas, right? What changes can they, in sort of their ownership or business model, could they consider as they think about the future?
Well, for this is Sue. For one thing, I would really be, this is going to sound very snarky and I apologize, but I really hope that they are looking at the Massachusetts law and regulatory situation to understand that there is a different world ahead. And one of the things that might be worthwhile putting out there is that natural gas companies, by their very nature, see themselves as competing to capture market share. They don't have the same obligation to serve.
Right.
And so they are going to be competing with oil. They are going to be seeing themselves as competing with electricity. And then either making shifts in their business model to see ahead of where the puck is going, so that they have a position to play that's you know, going to be very financially viable for them, or they are going to play a resistance game, which is going to be really tough. And in that latter one, I would take us back to Mark's comments at the beginning. Things like revenue decoupling don't help. They were very important at a time when the industry was shifting in terms of its growth strategy versus, you know, just all of the things that led us to revenue decoupling for gas ahead of electricity. That right now ends up being something that just fans the flames. So thinking about that and other things to create those different financial incentives to encourage gas companies to look ahead at business model changes is really key.
Interesting.
I would maybe zoom out and just add that we are asking utilities to do something hugely different and fundamentally different than what they have historically been asked to do, and than what the existing business model was built for, which was big capital projects and expanding the system further. And, you know, that has been a system that has worked for many decades and is not the model or the formula or what we will need to be using going forward when we're thinking about a a shrinking system, or even frankly a static system, though we know that it needs to be a shrinking system. And so I think we can't underestimate how big the question is. And to Sue's point, I think there is real opportunity for leadership. And in order for this to happen in a planned and equitable way, we need that leadership. Mark, I don't remember quite what the tagline is from your recent paper, but those 3 sentences of a planned transition is an equitable transition, and you could probably tell me what the others are. But if this happens in a haphazard and unplanned way, I think there will be really big consequences in terms of a utility death spiral, over-reliance on RNG leading to really spiking gas prices, more customers leaving, the customers who are remaining facing increasingly unaffordable bills, and so on. Which is not to say that I know exactly what the answer is, but I think it really is either a big pivot in business model towards becoming a thermal utility, the geomicro district, things like that, that are alternate, that change the fundamental business model, both in terms of, I would say, probably how regulation allows them to make money, and also the mechanism of not making money just on the amount of gas that is sold, or a managed transition away from the system as we know it today, and knowing that as we think about retiring shared assets, that absolutely requires really strong coordination and planning. And I think sometimes the elephant in the room is just, wow, that all sounds really expensive. And I don't think it can all fall to ratepayers. I think we are going to need additional funding, whether that is state or federal. And all of that also requires planning and coordination.
Yeah, let me ask a question about pathway number 1. Let's say that utilities decide that, yeah, we do want to be thermal providers, and they want to get into the geothermal business. Should ratepayers be helping them do that? Or or are they now in a new industry, they're looking to go into a new business, and they should be financing it themselves?
Okay, this is Sue. I'll venture out tentatively on that one. So far, our local distribution gas companies make money when they build something. And let's say they built nothing more. The depreciation schedules would create a smaller and smaller amount of money that needs to be collected. And it would not be a growing company. The investors at that point ought to be rattling the cage to encourage the companies to get into other businesses in order to make them attractive places for investment. In that sense, I think that those are business model questions that are outside the monopoly, in quotes, pipeline system. And I would encourage a very healthy and robust conversation about making sure that questions that we've had in the past about the extent to which gas companies or electric companies should get into other unregulated businesses, including ones where they're, getting appliances out there and other things that may be sketchy in terms of making sure that there's above and below the line cost recovery for competitive versus monopoly investments. Investors should be encouraging those kinds of activities outside the regulated monopoly piece in order to enable that company to transition into a different kind of role.
And we have some good examples, right, of that.
Yes.
We're seeing electric companies having their own non-regulated entities going into offshore wind.
Yep.
It's a new business for them, but they're not doing it it's not part of their monopoly business.
Well, maybe to complicate things even more, it's not always clear whether shareholders should care whether, since shareholders themselves are typically diversified, that it's not necessarily clear whether they would rather diversify across their assets or have their individual companies diversify,
Sure.
right? So
Sure.
you know, I think some of this is about how utility management is compensated and thinks about it, because they, you know, they are often not only get compensated partly in stock and are large, you know, significant owners as a part of their personal stake, but they, for a variety of reasons, they want to keep their stock price high, which is not the point of utility regulation, right? So I think there's a lot of very complicated incentives going on here, that when you buy a share of Eversource, you are buying part of that offshore wind and part of each gas company at the same time, right? You're not buying a share of Boston Gas Company anymore, or whatever the other corporate names are here. I think I just screwed up who owns what. But I think the you know, when we have these multiple fuel, big, conglomerates, right? What would be the business model if Time Warner bought Eversource, right? Like, what does Time Warner still exist? Am I 5 years behind? That these sort of broad corporate decisions get pretty complicated. I think that if you're looking at the gas LDC, right, as something that wants to continue on its own, there's a question about whether that's the objective. But I think moving into sort of other the other pipes in the grounds businesses is the clearest line of extension. The district energy. So I think that's the clearest line of sight to maintaining the gas LDC across multiple fuels.
Rebecca, could I just add something to Mark's, because I think he makes a very good set of points. I'm more worried about the standalone gas company than I am about the holding companies that have a lot of different kind of assets, both across electric and gas and between regulated and unregulated. Yes. In the past decade, we've seen a tremendous push by investors and rating agencies, and therefore companies, to move toward more regulated businesses because they are less risky in some sense. And so that's a real problem for a standalone gas company, and doing something to provide them with incentives for their companies to get to diversify, including in unregulated businesses, I think is going to be very important, and to start to do that well. I think that as I say, I'm very less worried about the ones that are electric and gas, because they have both lines of sight, and they're going to be doing shifting in different ways than the other.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think one risk is that they're going to want to have their cake and eat it too. That they want to have the cost recovery guarantees while making risky investments that we're not sure are going to pay out. So I think you just have to have a strong connection. That if they're going to insist on making investments that might not pay off in the future, that it's clear to everyone that the shareholders are taking on a risk there, and it's not necessarily going to be a free ride where if it doesn't pan out, they're going to make all their money anyway. So, but conversely, if you want to pull back and become and stay extremely low risk, start to pay things down, you're going to make all your. We'll happily help you make all your current money, but you have a low risk pathway there that sort of starts to pull back, right? So I think the important thing for consumers is that the utilities can't have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, let's go back to the consumer. Did someone want to talk? Sorry.
I was just gonna add one quick comment, Rebecca, if I could.
Of course.
I just wanted to add I'm thinking about the regulatory compact and how, there's a guaranteed rate of return to provide service, and how the public interest and what that means has evolved dramatically. And so I do think one of the key pieces, if we're just focusing on the LDC, I think we need a means of differentiating among, different company performance, because I think that would also really help in this conversation. But back to you, Rebecca. Sorry to cut you off.
No worries. No, that's a really good point. And I just wanted to pivot just a little bit because, in the end, I suspect the companies are going to take care of themselves some way or another. But I'm worried about the customer, and particularly the low-income customer. I'm wondering whether cost allocation or rate design are tools that might be helpful in thinking about helping out customers during this transition. I know you've been dying to talk about cost allocation and rate design.
Well, traditionally, we know that cost allocation is driven by theories of cost incurrence, where you're going to allocate the dollars based on whether they're driving the capital investments and so forth.
Hey, Sue, it might be helpful to, actually, I should have done this myself, but it might be helpful to say what cost allocation is.
Okay, let's put on
our
really wonky rate-making hats. You start with a revenue requirement. What are the dollars that are needed to make sure that the company can perform its services? And then you allocate those to different customer segments based on the extent to which they tend to drive the incurrence of those costs. So it may be, if it's customers that demand throughput during peak periods, let's say residential customers, traditionally, they would pick up more of the capital costs associated with the pipes than industrial customers who may switch to a different fuel off season in the peak period. So cost allocation is where do you put the total dollars into different customer segments? And as I said, traditionally, those have been quite tied to the extent to which customers are driving maintenance and investment in the pipe and around peak. But I'm wondering whether or not, from a just and reasonable rate making point of view, with this eye toward the energy transition, one has to come up with different theories about cost incurrence and cost responsibility. If there are some customers on the system who are low income or residential who are providing revenues to the company that make it so that industrial customers can go back and forth in terms of using the pipeline system, maybe that optionality ought to be something that goes into decisions about the extent to which some of those pipeline costs ought to be assigned to interruptible customers or customers who have different kinds of choices. So I think this calls for different theories based on the different energy transitions and the different roles and responsibilities of different customers providing things. And that would put some of the precedent of prior decisions on its head a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. Anybody else want to talk about cost allocation?
Come on, you guys.
Always, Rebecca, always. So I think that Stu makes some really good points there. The interruptible customers try to say they have no capacity cost obligations at all because they don't consume at peak times. But that's sort of the system isn't just built out for peak times. There's a basic part of the system that is used. They still use the pipes, right? And what you actually want to do in terms of allocating capacity costs is do a blend of peak times and year round. Or if you want to get really fancy, and now we have the data, you don't necessarily have the equivalent of AMI for gas, but if to the extent you have hourly data, you can do hourly cost allocation. We're not stuck doing cost allocation with an abacus anymore. We have, not only do we have spreadsheets, we have Stata and R and all these other things that can do really fancy, complicated things. the other thing is Massachusetts does have sort of residential heating and non-heating and low income customer classes, at least for most of the bigger utilities. But the distinctions that are made are pretty simplistic. And if you wanted to, for residential heating low income customers, you could do all sorts of things, and Sue sort of started to hint at them. But the easiest cost allocation thing to do is to say they get a lower share of administrative and general costs. Administrative and general costs are always arbitrary. There's no cost causation basis. We're just dividing up the pie. We're going to shield them from some of those things. From there, things get a little more complicated when you get into the mathematical analysis. I think on rate design, one thing to think about is so inclining block rates rightfully should go away on the electric side, but I think there's a big role for them on the gas side still. And one fun thing that they do in California is that the first block is much bigger in the winter than it is in the summer. So that the way that works is that small heating customers are protected from the rate increases, and big heating customers have that higher tail block price that gives a strong efficiency signal. So that's a way to give a strong efficiency signal and protect low usage customers at the same time. You're trying to hit multiple birds with the one stone there.
Is there any benefit to having more customer classes or defining them in different ways?
That's a great question. Go ahead, Mark.
No, I mean, I think if you look at the tariff sheets now, Massachusetts for residential you have 4 customer classes there.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure you need more. Maybe I think the rate design distinctions are pretty minimal. You could rearrange things, sure, I think.
Your question, Rebecca, makes me think that, and I haven't thought this through very well, so I'm probably dangerously going out here. You might think about rates for new gas customers that are appropriately creating price signals that indicate expensive situations in the future. If you're not going to mandate that if Massachusetts does not mandate that there are no new hookups, for example, or you cannot renovate with natural gas appliances, there could be ways in which events in the building trigger going on to a new tariff service where the pricing really does pick up different depreciation rates or other things. So there are disincentives. And we know that there are these triggers. For example, if you're going to, on the electric side, if you're going to put on solar panels and you have an interconnection that you have to then go on to a new service. Right. Maybe there are other ways to distinguish triggers like that on the gas side. If you have to get a gas inspection for a new pipeline, I'm
right. That's really interesting idea.
I don't know. Maybe there's a new service offering for existing versus new as a way to capture these appropriate, what we might call disincentives, but appropriate pricing mechanisms.
I mean, some people have talked about exit fees. How do we feel about exit fees? I mean, it doesn't really help with the incentive that we're trying to do, with how we're trying to incentivize people and then charge them to go off. But, it may help the people who stay on.
Well, in a world of customer choice, I think putting those exit fees is going to really hinder electrification.
I think so too, yeah.
Yeah, well, so the one other thing I'd throw in the mix here is that, to the extent that people just want to be on used gas for cooking, that we need to that the way non-heating rates work already is that they have much higher per therm rate. And there's other ways to basically say, look, if you really just want to use your gas stove forever, we're going to charge you more for it. That's
like $900 a therm, basically. The cost of the system.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows I'm not a huge fan of customer charges, but that might be one of the exceptions to my more general rule.
Right. The situation in which the gas system needs to be maintained as it is today, only for gas stoves, is a nightmare on
Yes,
pretty much
exactly.
every level.
It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, we're not going
That
to be able
can,
to do that. People are going to have
and
to.
I think there will need to be price signals, or at least changes to the way that gas is priced from how it is now, in order to ensure that.
Say, is it really worth it to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am a brand new induction stove convert, so I'm happy to evangelize at any point in time.
It's sort of like the people, you guys are too young for this, but the people who used to talk about Volvos all the time when they were out. Now people who have induction stoves are just so excited about them. My mother cannot be quiet about her induction stove. So I think they are going to catch on when people realize how great they are to use, actually. But we're going to have to get, I think, going to have to get some incentives out there to encourage people to do that.
It's kind of like electric cars. They sound so novel, but when you drive them, they are so fun. So,
They are really
they'll
fun.
compete with a Mustang anytime. So
I mean, who knew that they were so fast?
right.
They're so fast. Anyway, back on to our topic. Sherry or Natalie, do you have anything more you want to say about cost allocation or rate design?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, I think grounding those cost allocation discussions in the planning effort, and we first really need to do a rigorous assessment of who's going to be using the system long term. What are the hard to electrify end uses? And I think that can then inform this discussion we're having about which, pot of dollars goes where.
But Natalie raises another great point, which is somewhat of a in tension with the point I made a minute ago. I agree with what you just said. And yet some of those sectors are industrial users. And I was just saying they should pick up more of the residential customers' capital costs. So this is like a hard equation, duh.
This is a hard one.
Yeah.
So when people hear about securitization, maybe you can talk a little bit about what that means and why it might be a useful tool in the toolkit. Nobody wants to talk about securitization.
No, I mean I'm happy to, but right. So there's a couple different levels here, and I think it ends up meaning slightly different things in different places. But the basic thrust is that you take a portion of the current rate base, a set of capital investments that are currently being basically financed with the weighted average cost of capital, the return on equity, and the debt. And you basically instead, you take it out of normal rate base, and you instead finance that with low cost debt that has a slightly different guarantee than normal utility bonds. So often what that means is that, for example, it can't be discharged in bankruptcy. That if the utility goes bankrupt, the ratepayers afterwards still have to pay for that cost. It can't go away. But then it could have some kind of other state guarantee. There's a number of ways to try to really get the highest possible level of guarantee for that debt, and thus get the lowest possible rate. I think there's a couple of funny things that are going on there, but I'll let somebody else go first.
Well, Massachusetts has an experience with securitization back in the day when the electric industry restructured, and we're kind of talking about a restructuring here of the gas industry. So remember back then, which was 2.5 decades ago, when all of the people on this screen besides me were babies, by the way. So they might not remember this, but I do.
It's a good thing I'm not on the screen.
A lot of the power plants that were owned then by utility companies, by the electric companies, had above market costs, and that was causing a resistance, concerns about those dollars and who was going to have to pay for those dollars, led to a resistance in restructuring. And so the the simple way to describe the solution was there was created a pot of dollars that were associated with the above market costs for power plants. The utilities got the market costs for power plants when they sold them off. And then the difference between that and what was on the books was put into a securitization package and then paid for bit by bit by bit over I think it was 20, 25-year period.
Yeah, 25
really
years.
long period.
Yeah.
Everybody had to pick those up. They were non-bypassable charges, and it's a way to just smooth out the effect so that the customers who are on the beat at the time of that restructuring, they don't have to absorb all of those costs. And so it's really a socialization in some sense of the costs of these very big transformations in the industry.
That sort of raises the question of future customers versus customers today. What should we be thinking about in terms of putting cost on future customers or requiring current customers to pay?
Well, so yeah, so this and the depreciation, all this stuff is linked because it's about how you're paying back these long-lived assets, right? The depreciation timeline, it's funny because the asset life, people always treated that as a deterministic thing, like, but there was always shades of gray. And that when you picked a 30-year depreciation timeline for a power plant or a 70-year depreciation timeline for a gas pipe, that there was a lot, they were often trying to pick the longest possible time frame in order to minimize year one costs, right? That was one of the things that was going on. But that ignored all those shades of gray that people knew were there. And now we have to build some of those things back in. So it's not always the case that you have to go from 70 years to 25 years on a depreciation timeline, just to pick an arbitrary example. But yeah, these are tools, both how long are your bonds? Are you going to go to securitization? You're picking different methods, different trajectories of how you're paying back these long-lived investments. And I think it's just, pulling in costs that are scheduled to be recovered in 40 years to today is one of those things you have to take a hard look at, because you do worry about today's ratepayers too. But so there'll be a balance. But you just have to look at all these tools and sometimes recognize that there's a little bit of art in addition to the science.
Yeah, Rebecca, I'm thinking about your question in the context of existing infrastructure and then new infrastructure. And the existing infrastructure questions are more difficult. And, I think we've talked about aligning depreciation schedules and securitization and other tools. I think a first important step, and we're seeing this in New York, is that utilities should conduct a depreciation study, considering the impact of climate laws on their assets. I think that's step one and the first step in this journey. And then for new infrastructure, I think we need to start applying more rigorous review. And that can come in a lot of different forms. It could be a gas investment priority order. Let's maximize energy efficiency, demand response programs, non-pipeline alternatives, and everything else before we get to a traditional infrastructure type project. Let's bring in an independent consultant to help us review some of these projects. Let's use an RFP type process, if there is an identified need, to make sure that we're getting a really robust and competitive set of solutions to address that need. And then let's consider the greenhouse gas implications. I feel like traditional gas supply planning is conducted completely independent of that. And we have to start integrating that type of analysis so that we can make informed decisions. Is this getting us closer to achievement of climate goals or further away?
Mm-hmm.
Rebecca, could I pile on to
Yes.
that point? This question really is important. And there's so many reasons for it. Mark has addressed really important practical issues associated with the financial and economic structure of the nuts and bolts of rate making. Those are really practical issues. The extent to which the DPU moves off of precedent in practical ways that they've been doing this in the past, there'll be challenges for sure, and yet those practical issues have to be done. From the other side of the spectrum, and Natalie was kind of going after this, are really existential questions about today's consumers versus tomorrow's. In some sense, the New York legislature that Natalie has pointed to, that enacted that the very, very bold New York law, they're similar to the very bold and aspirational, not aspirational, concrete directives by the Massachusetts legislature that says global warming is a problem for us today and moreover for the future. So we can think about future citizens and we can think about future customers, and in some ways the legislature may need to be more direct in saying, yep, this has to be built into rate making. But it seems to me that a set of regulators who were embracing the letter and spirit of the law, the Global Warming Solutions Act, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the new Massachusetts law. I apologize. That has to be a whole of government approach. And so thinking about this question about how to move from traditional rate making into views about future customers to protect them, because they are going to pay for today's customers' use of pretty cheap gas.
Yeah, exactly.
Really cheap gas. And so I think there's really important kind of political economy, social equity issues here that are built into your very simple but important question.
Yeah, and I would add to that the new climate law in Massachusetts, I think, gives the DPU a lot more leeway in making changes. The new climate law specifically says that the DPU, as part of its mission, needs to now think about these issues and not just their traditional. They need to think about equity, and they need to think about climate. So I do think that gives them more leeway, but it also raises the question, Sue, of in that same law, there's going to be a stretch code in Massachusetts that can be opted in by towns, and I'm wondering how the coordination between the DPU and what's going to go on in individual towns, whether there's how that might work.
Yeah, that's a great element to bring into this discussion. And I always hate to point to California as a place that people on the East Coast could look at. And I certainly would never do it in the Midwest. I would never say to look to California. But as another leader on these climate issues and efficiency issues, the way that the stretch codes in California have really stepped out, both from a statewide point of view for buildings. And this is the stretch code that I'm talking about is one that is just uber efficient for new and highly renovated properties, and that require solar as part of that picture. There are some lessons about process-wise how they have worked with towns to as stakeholders, really critical stakeholders and partners in that process. So I think having the state have more robust partnerships with the towns in light of that, I think should be high on the agenda, not for the DPU, but for the Energy Office for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Rebecca, this is Sherry, to go back for a second, I felt struck by your choice of words in terms of leeway, that the law allows the DPU some leeway to make decisions differently. And I think that's true. And I also think that what is needed to address the scale is actually leadership and the willingness to take bold and new action in ways that, as we've already talked about, are really different and really new. And I am very glad that increasingly, I think the DPU and other PUCs are are feeling like they have statutory authority to make decisions based on different things. And I wonder whether, in order for that to happen at the scale and speed and comprehensiveness that is required, whether they also need, what else would be needed to be able to do that, and whether that is explicit legislative direction as opposed to permission, or what is needed to really take, I've never ridden a horse in my life, but some sort of metaphor about taking the horse by its reins, and really sort of, now I'm mixing them, but changing course.
Yeah,
I was just struck by that.
Yeah, no, I think I was thinking about it in terms of sort of, I think that actually the new legislation is a mandate. I don't think it's a choice, but what I was trying to say is, because they have a mandate, they have the ability now to, I think, be more creative. But I do think this transition can't be on the back of the DPU. I mean, it's got to be, it needs to be a whole integrated plan, which is why I sort of was asking about the towns, because the DPU has its jurisdiction over utilities, but what it doesn't have jurisdiction over is all this other stuff we're talking about. So I think you raise a really good point.
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mark. Go.
No, I mean, just to connect a couple dots, I think the most obvious place where that comes in is the supply forecast. That, we have a bit, as gas usage continues to get more efficient and towns start to put in other restrictions as well. If the forecast the gas utilities are using are consistent with reasonable projections for that, then none of their investment planning will be reasonable either. So I think that's the most obvious linkage there. The other funny thing that I think some of my colleagues realized when we started to write the report is that residential gas usage across the country has been flat for the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. And I think, this is one of those things when you say not enough people knew that, it's a confession that you didn't know that. But I think it's a salient. Well, I don't know about, yeah. Now that I have 2 kids, I feel a lot older. But that residential usage particularly has been getting a lot more efficient over time, and despite the fact that we've been adding customers to the gas system, the therm throughput has been, and if anything, it's going to start going down given the ratcheting up of all these other things.
The thing that I was going to say is that the conversation has shifted in really good ways from let's let the market satisfy these problems and get the price signals right, to a much deeper role for planning. And there's a role for other state agencies in that planning. We've talked about that. There's a role for towns to shepherd what they want to happen in their own communities, and to have that be part of the issues that are before the state in its planning efforts. I think that there's also a leadership role for all of the organizations that are hosting this webinar series. I mean, I think that the work that the AG is doing to really move this conversation forward is incredibly important, because the AG's office has a point of view that is both trying to be an advocate in particular proceedings, but also set the table for identifying what the issues are. EDF plays an incredible role in bringing a record forward in proceedings that are robust and creative in thinking about these issues. Both, in the states that I'm aware of, EDF plays an incredible role both in policy design, but also in advocacy and legal representation to move the agenda in terms of giving a commission a bold record to stand on. And of course, RAP and RMI have done incredible thought leadership on these issues. So there's a very broad leadership role that can help the DPU and that can help the state move forward on these issues, because we don't have all the answers for sure. So I just kudos to all of you guys for that.
Yeah, well, I certainly think if going back 2 years ago, I'm not sure that we had this much interest. I think people are really on board with thinking about this now, and figuring it out, and really appreciate you all coming here today to help us do that. I think we're going to take a break in 2 minutes, but is there anything else somebody wants to get in before the break? If not, we will just move on. Well, thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Again, really sorry about my situation here, but I have enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully next time I will see your faces. So we're going to take a break from until 11:30, and then we will come back with Q&A. So thank you all very much. See you in a few minutes.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I think we're waiting for Sherry, and I'm not sure if Rebecca is on.
Sorry, Joanne, I am on.
Okay, great.
I was
And
attempting to get on through my phone, but that failed. So I am where I am.
We should have a
And-
nice picture poster of you to have up on the screen.
Yeah.
Cardboard
Here's
version.
Sherry, great. Okay, so Jessica and I are going to ask you some questions that have been fielded from the audience in attendance, listening to that great conversation between everyone. And we are going to start with one that I think will do some good conversation. And it was building on a question that Rebecca had asked, you know, what obligations do ratepayers and the regulators have to ensure that the gas companies actually stay in business? And we'll open it up to everyone, including you, Rebecca.
I'll let someone else go first on that one.
Well, I mean, I think the obligation is there's the only real obligation is the constitutional backstop here, that there's a reasonable opportunity to make a fair rate of return. That is not a guarantee that they will be in business forever. You know, I think that what you want to worry about is the different stakeholders involved, that we have a lot of workers and ratepayers who are, you know, effectively invested in the current system in a different way than shareholders, and that you want to have a you know, to get flexibility so that you can you know, pivot the system, and then if and when we really do need to get off big portions of the gas system, that it's orderly and planned and not a death spiral. So I think that there are you know, effective obligations that are a little bit less formal than the you know, the technical legal obligation here.
I think it goes to a friend. Go ahead, Sherry.
I would echo that, and I'm not going to get the name of the case right, but I know that there, in the early 1900s, there was a question about whether a trolley company could still earn a rate of return despite the fact that people were no longer really using trolleys. Whoever is a lawyer, feel free to correct me while I get the details of this very wrong.
Was that Market
but
Street
my understanding
Railway?
my understanding is that it essentially said that the answer to that question was no, and that it was not the job of the commission to keep them in business when that was not what was happening. I agree with Mark that there are a lot of other considerations, and the function of a reasonable rate of return is, from my perspective, is not for the point of the profit, but for the point of being able to provide affordable service in the way that we need for all customers. And I think remembering sort of the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law, why do we actually care about this thing is.
Well, I just throw in this, Rebecca. I just throw in that they have an opportunity to earn a rate of return. They don't have a guarantee that they're going to earn a rate of return, but I do think that, you know, we don't have the luxury of simply saying, you know, we don't go out of business, do your thing, because I agree with Mark, we've got to worry about how that's going to impact customers and workers. And, so I think legally we do not have an obligation to save these companies. But from a practical matter, I think we do need to think about how we're going to take care of other issues.
I'm going to venture out in, like Sherry, as non-lawyers, to say something about this. The three prior speakers have been talking about, in response to Joanne's question about obligations, and it's an obligation to serve. It's not an obligation to be in business forever. And so in some sense, this may come back to franchise issues about the state's expectations about what service means by the holder of that effective franchise. And I can't say that I'm an expert on franchise law in Massachusetts, but I think that ought to be dusted off in terms of examination of whether there are ways that that concept can evolve. I think there will be questions inevitably that go to the courts about whether, if there has been a lot of investment made on behalf of providing that obligation to serve, that end up being stranded, there'll be a huge political problem of resistance and business protection, until there's an expectation that somehow that taking, I may be misusing the concept of taking, but I assume that there will be discussions about whether the state has just taken the investment opportunity away by changes in the industry structure, that thinking about securitization and other things might address this difference between the opportunity to earn a return and the fact that there are going to be stranded costs out there if they're not recovered by consumers. And if they're recovered by consumers fully, that last person standing on the system is going to be a really, really challenging to pay their bills.
Yeah, I mean, it's in Massachusetts, it is interesting that electric companies have an obligation to serve. Gas companies, as you said earlier, Sue, don't.
Yeah.
They may say to a customer, you know what, you're too far away, we're not going to serve you. Or a customer, and the reason for that has been because there's competition. There's no competition for electricity. You have to have electricity. That's the only way you're going to turn on your light. But there are other ways to heat your home. And that's really true today. So there is no obligation to serve that we need to worry about, I don't think. On the issue of stranded costs and taking, I mean, I think it would be nice if we could all avoid having that discussion.
Yes. Rebecca, could you comment? I'm going to ask you a question. As a follow-up, can you comment on what we know about the obligation to serve customers who already are hooked up to the system?
Yeah, that's right. They have a public service obligation to provide safe and reliable service, right? Once you have a customer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's my understanding anyway. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong.
Jessica, you want to field our next question?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start with a fairly open-ended question to follow up on some of the things we talked about earlier about the new climate bill in Massachusetts. So among other things, the DPU will be required to consider equity and the state's greenhouse gas emissions limits as a factor in their decision making. So just wondering if you can discuss what you expect to change after the law goes into effect, and also what you want to see change. And maybe if Natalie can start us off.
Sure. I guess I'll start with the second part, what you would like to see changed. I mean, I would like to see a whole revamp of, the regulations that the DPU has to update those and really center issues of equity and climate and environment in their decision making. So I think, where I started, rooting out the things that don't work and adding in additional requirements to set the DPU up well for what it has to do. I think the second piece, what it really needs in order to achieve that objective, is the amount, the right amount of information from the utilities. And so it can't make those new determinations unless and until the utility, provides that. And I think that will really help and assist the DPU in making those determinations.
I think it might be a great opportunity for the DPU to articulate through a rulemaking process a policy statement on how they will do that across their various programmatic areas. I'm thinking of the very controversial policy statement that FERC has in place for how it will look at various issues in certificating natural gas pipeline project proposals. It is controversial in part because the world has changed in the last 25 years or 20 years since that was made, but the actual vehicle of thinking about the various angles of the issues, what's needed from a planning point of view, how should these directives from the legislature impact rate making considerations, just basically taking everything that is in the question pool here for these two sessions that the AG is hosting, and then moving those over into a policy statement rulemaking would be very helpful. There would be a lot of creative ideas that many different stakeholders have, including others in government, that could inform the extent to which and creativity that the DPU can bring to decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have sort of another long laundry list. Beyond the laundry list I said at the beginning, that if you want to revamp planning, there shouldn't just be supply forecast proceedings that are closed and have very few parties. There should be an open access gas integrated resource planning proceeding, right? It's there's some states that have done gas integrated planning for the last 30 years. It was sort of an afterthought after electric IRPs, in the 80s and 90s. But there are states that have done that, and you can have a much broader discussion that incorporates a lot of the things that have been touched on last week and this week. And look, you can have a whole, equity. The key thing with equity is it shouldn't be like there's not one equity program that satisfies all these needs. You really have to work it in to the recipe at each stage in the process. That the IRP, you got to bring in the affected communities to make sure what their energy needs are and how they can be served safely and reliably going forward. So and then the same thing happens at the energy efficiency programs, the electrification programs, non-pipeline solutions programs. All of these different pieces have to have equity components, it's not a side dish. It's got to be part of the recipe for the dinner you're making.
And I think there's go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to say that the equity concept has really different and very important distinctions between the affordability question in terms of equity of access to energy systems to be part of the society and the economy, but it also is about physical facilities and thinking about the kind of environmental justice issues as part of equity in terms of how the DPU makes its decisions about maybe approving pipeline extensions that on the distribution system, other things. So all of these things, including those non-wires alternatives, non-pipe alternatives, are really important.
So I would just add one more to your list, which is procedural equity and how the processes can be designed so that more people can participate in more accessible ways. And I know that DPU is starting to think about this right now, but I think in order to achieve those goals, we have to bring more people into the discussion and make sure that there's plenty of seats at the table for everyone to contribute.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
was going to just say the same thing, Natalie. I think step number one is making sure that everybody has an opportunity to participate in the DPU's decision making. And our office has been focusing on that quite a bit. We're forming a stakeholder working group to make recommendations to the DPU about revising their procedural regulations as well as the EFSB. The goal is to have an inclusive discussion about it and then make recommendations. So I think that is step number one. And I really like Sue's idea of having sort of this open discussion through a rulemaking, probably not a rulemaking, through an investigation that makes it easier to sort of get some guidance about how the DPU is going to implement this new mandate of their mission. You know, I think that's a they have a choice, right? They can either do it that way or they can do it case by case. And their tradition has been to do it case by case. You know, having a big proceeding like that would take a significant amount of time and resources for them, and they do have to think about priorities. But I think it would be really helpful to have that conversation and let them hear from various people about recommendations on how to do that.
Anybody else have anything further to say? Otherwise, I will ask what is potentially kind of an in the weeds question about consideration as to whether or not there should be any prohibited spending by the gas LDCs, and specifically in either promoting continued natural gas use through advertising or support of, groups that are promoting and continuing promoting natural gas. Should there be a limitation on that spending because it's, counter to the Massachusetts climate goals or counter to achievement of climate goals?
I could imagine that in the absence of a settlement, like Sherry was describing, or was it Natalie who was describing in New York? So it was Sherry, that there could be free speech considerations that are put forward about how the DPU might muzzle a utility from making promoting its product. But it seems to me that there could be, again, in the absence of a settlement, there could be ways in which DPU could put performance disincentives in place. Not only that clearly prohibit such recovery of such dollars in rates, that would be a minimum, but there may be other ways from a performance point of view for the DPU to do adjustments to rate of return or something else associated with the company's alignment in its practices and communications with the spirit and law of the Massachusetts legislature.
I mean, there is definitely precedent for the DPU to tell a utility, no, you are not going to be able to recover that cost because it is not consistent with what ratepayers should be paying for. Like, for instance, lobbying fees cannot be recovered from ratepayers. So you certainly could see a situation where they can say whatever they want, but maybe ratepayers shouldn't be paying for it.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think there's quite a big difference between prohibiting speech as its own entity and whether a utility should be spending ratepayer money on arguably misleading and inaccurate statements around how clean or affordable or healthy natural gas is. I have heard people make parallels to the way that tobacco is advertised. And as we know more and more, especially about the health impacts of combusting natural gas in our homes, I think that it does prompt real questions about certainly what ratepayer money should be used to advertise, but also what types of statements should be made to the public. And I'll pause there maybe.
Yeah, and as a thought experiment, building off of what Sherry just said, picture if the DPU were really interested in getting alignment with the with a regulated utilities public statements. One could look not only at promotional material, but also language in SEC filings with regard to plans, intentions, risk disclosures. And I'm not saying that the DPU would be the SEC, but it could inform the DPU's decisions about the extent to which the utility was actually moving in the direction that Massachusetts is moving.
Well, they certainly can't. They certainly can't issue misleading information, right? The Attorney General's office has,
Good
rules.
point. Oh, good point.
Rules about that. So, there's a fine line, right? But if they are sending out misleading information or fraudulent information, then that's not okay.
And I think it is, it is more nuanced than this is an outright lie. I think statements around natural gas being the clean option that customers should choose are rooted in a time when it made so much sense to do oil to gas conversions, and it was seen as the clean alternative. And I don't think that is true any longer. I think you could make that statement and then have an asterisk that says, but only when we're talking about these specific fossil fuels. But I think we could also just move on from the framing of gas being the clean option when we know that we need to be moving towards other solutions, and heat pumps in particular.
I think many of the things that we're saying lead me to think that this whole endeavor needs to be one that we're all doing together. And whether that results in settlements, whether that is coming from the DPU, I just think that if we're going to spend the next 5 years litigating and fighting about stuff, we're just not going to get it done. And so I think conversations like this and future conversations that listen to all different views, I just feel like it's something that, like restructuring, we just need to do together.
I totally agree with you, Rebecca, if I can chime in, even though I'm not a panelist. And I think that the open docket before the department at 2080 is that opportunity for the LDCs to react, adapt, and become part of the movement moving forward. I think if they come to the table in a positive way, which I'm hopeful, and we all get together, we can come up with a solution that will work for everybody and our most vulnerable to all participants in the process. And there was a question, and I'm going to kind of jump in here about that. If the panelists have sensed any shift from the LDCs, whether it's in Massachusetts or across the country, thinking about their redesign or their new business model. And Sue just had to jump for a previous engagement, so that's why we just lost Dr. Tierney.
Well, I might suggest that New York has been leading the way to a certain extent on some of these issues with coming in. I mean, I think Natalie has been participating in some of these. So some of the settlements in gas rate cases over the last year or two have been, not only non-pipe solutions, but the depreciation stuff and other key issues. So.
Yeah, I would just add, I do think there's been a lot of interesting and creative ideas presented in New York, and I have seen definitely a shift in thinking in some utilities who are issuing their own company greenhouse gas targets and plans for achieving those. And so I think there is a there's a move in the right direction. I think we have to do a lot more to ultimately get where we need to be. But just adding one thing to the last thread of conversation about just education and what Sherry said about rooting this in the historical evolution of when gas was considered a cleaner alternative to oil and kerosene and other fossil fuels, but now, you know, explaining the imperative to decarbonize by mid-century and what the science tells us we have to do to make that happen. I think that's part of it. You know, make sure we spend the time to do that so we can hopefully achieve some more common ground.
Agreed. Any final remarks before we end this in robust conversation? Very appreciative of everyone's time and participation. Really good discussion, but leave it if anybody has any final remarks.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This has been great.
Oh, it was our pleasure, and really thank you for participating. And everyone have a great rest of your day, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.